It all began with a bombshell allegation. Jasmine Crockett, accused of interfering with the federal judiciary and suspended for 5 years. But when she came face to face with Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, she overturned the entire hearing with a single question and a $2.7 million secret buried deep beneath the system. Within 24 hours, his authority was stripped, his reputation destroyed. The system froze. What did Jasmine say that brought a Supreme Court justice to his knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The wind over Washington, D.C. that morning was sharp enough to cut steel. At exactly 6:13 a.m., Jasmine Crockett's phone buzzed with a message that felt less like due process and more like a warning shot. You are hereby summoned to appear before the D.C. Federal Court of Appeals at 9 a.m. No explanation. No counsel notified. No precedent cited. Just raw urgency, cloaked in cold legality. The official charge? A vague accusation. Abuse of influence to interfere with federal judicial proceedings. But no one paying attention believed that was the real reason. Just 3 days earlier, Jasmine had stood in a Senate oversight hearing and delivered a blistering critique of the federal judiciary, accusing it of insulating itself from accountability, while average citizens bore the weight of its decisions. She hadn't named a single judge. She hadn't needed to. Her words had landed like a precision strike, and now the system was retaliating in the most public way possible. Inside the towering gray walls of the courthouse, the air turned even colder, not by thermostat, but by tension. The gallery was filled with reporters, Hill staffers, and an unusually high number of federal court observers, all sensing something abnormal. Then the chamber doors creaked open, and the room held its breath. Brett Kavanaugh entered, not as a guest or a symbolic figurehead, but as the court's presiding judicial supervisor for the hearing. His appearance wasn't just unprecedented, it was deeply inappropriate, a breach of both tradition and principle. As a sitting Supreme Court justice, he had no jurisdiction, no procedural role, no constitutional mandate in this venue. Yet he strode in with the calm authority of a man used to rewriting the rules. His eyes swept the courtroom once and then locked onto Jasmine. Every camera shutter fired at once, every breath held. What should have been a dry procedural hearing had just transformed into something else entirely. A political crucifixion dressed up in judicial robes. And as he took his seat on the bench, it became clear. This wasn't going to be a hearing. It was going to be an execution with robes. The gavel hadn't even struck before the attack began. Jasmine's counsel, an experienced constitutional attorney with 2 decades in federal litigation, rose to speak, but got no further than his name. Brett Kavanaugh lifted one hand and cut him off mid-breath, his tone razor-sharp and dismissive. "We don't need rehearsed defenses here," he said, the words snapping through the courtroom like a whip. It wasn't a legal objection. It was a silencing, and it was deliberate. The cameras caught it, so did the legal observers. Then came the pivot, surgical, calculated. Kavanaugh turned his head slowly, locking his eyes on Jasmine, not as a judge to a citizen, but as a man staring down a challenge to his authority. "You," he said, flat, almost amused at the audacity of her silence. "You are a dangerous cocktail, political ambition, low ethics, and confidence entirely unearned." The words landed like punches, each one meant to bruise, not to argue. A collective hush fell over the room. Even some of the most seasoned court correspondents looked stunned. This wasn't judicial language. It was personal degradation disguised as law. Jasmine didn't blink. Her back stayed straight, her breathing calm, but in her eyes the cold fury of someone who had heard these kinds of attacks before, from men who feared not her mistakes, but her refusal to stay in her place. She didn't reach for a rebuttal. She didn't plead. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a statement. "You don't get to define me, even here." Kavanaugh wasn't finished. He leaned back slightly, his voice now slower, quieter, but even more venomous. "Individuals like you should not be anywhere near Congress or any institution that holds real power." There was no mistaking the weight of the word "you." It wasn't about the case. It wasn't about rules. It was about who Jasmine was. A black woman, outspoken, unafraid, and unbending in the face of privilege. What he said wasn't just a judgment, it was a warning to anyone watching. If you challenge this system, it will come for you too. His robe had become a shield, his bench a throne, and his words a verdict without trial. Before Jasmine or her legal team could respond, Kavanaugh picked up a single sheet from the folder in front of him and signed his name with an air of finality. His eyes never left the paper. This court hereby issues a 5-year suspension from all governmental duties, he announced, voice dry, almost bored. Effective immediately, you are further prohibited from seeking public office during the duration of this sanction. He didn't cite precedent. He didn't offer rationale. He didn't ask for deliberation. He didn't care. In less than 20 minutes, a sitting congresswoman had been stripped of her duties by a judge who wasn't supposed to be there, without evidence, without process, and without shame. Outside, the headlines were already forming like storm clouds. Kavanaugh silences Crockett, justice or power play. Courtroom clash sparks outcry. No defense allowed. Inside, the silence turned funereal. It wasn't just the end of a hearing. It was the sound of a democratic system being bent, right there, on camera, for millions to witness. And Jasmine, though struck down, remained still. Her body may have been seated, but her presence had just shaken the foundations of that courtroom more than any gavel ever could. The room might have moved on, but Jasmine hadn't. Not in her mind, not in her memory, and not in the marrow of who she had become. She sat upright, jaw tight, spine rigid as stone, while the courtroom returned to its formal hush. But inside, the words hurled at her just moments ago were still echoing, louder than any gavel. Low ethics. Unearned confidence. She had heard that tone before, not in courtrooms but on curbsides and classroom hallways, in whispers and police radios. They never said the word race, but it clung to every syllable. As Kavanaugh's voice faded, a different one rose in her memory, the shout of a white police officer under a street lamp in Houston. She was 17. She had done nothing but walk home from a debate meet, hoodie up, hands in her coat pockets. He stopped her for suspicious behavior. When she looked him in the eye, something in him snapped. "Don't look at me like you have rights," he growled, before shoving her face first into the pavement. Her cheek tore open on the sidewalk. His knee pinned her to the concrete. Her breath caught between fear and fury. But she didn't cry. She remembered counting the cracks in the street as if memorizing injustice, one line at a time. It wasn't the first time she'd been told she didn't belong, but it was the first time she realized that belonging had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with power. That moment became the first building block of something bigger. It carried her through college, where professors often mistook her silence for ignorance until she raised her hand and dismantled arguments with precision. But the hardest lessons came later. In her first year of law school, Jasmine was nearly expelled for an outburst in a constitutional law class. They were discussing the Trayvon Martin case, parsing it like a hypothetical. Jasmine stood up, voice shaking with restrained rage, and told the class, "You don't get to treat Black Death like an intellectual exercise." The professor asked her to leave. She did, but she came back hours later, alone, not out of apology, but defiance. She found a corner in the campus library and studied landmark civil rights cases under flickering lights until sunrise. No one saw her there. No one applauded. But that night she made a decision. She would master the system that once tried to erase her from it. She chose public defense not because it was glamorous, it wasn't, but because it put her face to face with the same cruelty she had lived through. Clients with broken English, no bail money, no families left, Black boys charged as men, immigrant women too afraid to speak their names. She listened to them when no one else would, took cases other attorneys dismissed as unwinnable and turned them into victories, not with prestige, but with relentless preparation and a fire that never left her since Houston. She won 9 straight civil rights cases, not because the system bent for her, but because she refused to bend to it. Her victories made her a target. They called her too emotional, too loud, too radical. But Jasmine had long learned that what they call too much is usually just enough to change something real. And now here she was, not in front of a jury, not behind a desk, but in a courtroom rigged against her, being judged by a man who'd never been held accountable for his own past. A man whose confirmation hearings had silenced women who dared to speak. A man whose robe now masked the bruises left behind by unchecked power. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't lower her gaze. She let the silence do what words couldn't. Because deep within her, something far stronger than shame was rising. If I don't stand now, how many more voices will be buried before they even speak? And just as the courtroom doors closed behind her, the system that had humiliated her in public made a critical mistake. It forgot that silence doesn't mean surrender. Jasmine moved like a shadow through the courthouse corridor, the weight of injustice still coiled around her chest. Behind her, the courtroom still echoed with verdicts dressed as vengeance. Ahead, a gauntlet of cameras and murmurs waited, hungry for a quote, a collapse, anything to confirm the image of defeat. But before she could descend the marble stairs, a voice, not spoken but felt, interrupted the script. From the far edge of the hallway, half hidden in the recessed shadows beneath a bronze statue of justice, stood Senator Allen Rivers. He didn't raise his hand or call her name. He simply stepped forward, eyes heavy with something Jasmine hadn't seen in that courtroom. Knowledge sharpened by years of betrayal. In a motion practiced and precise, he brushed past her shoulder and, with the stealth of a man who knew how many eyes were watching, pressed a thin, brown leather envelope into her hand. It felt heavier than it looked, like it held not just documents, but the weight of consequences. Then he turned without a word, disappearing into a private elevator before anyone could register the exchange. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't pause. She just kept walking. Out of the courthouse, through the chaos and into the armored silence of her waiting car. Only once the doors closed behind her, muting the outside world, did she open the envelope. The contents hit like a second trial, this time without a judge. Neatly folded pages, some faded with age, others crisp with urgency, lay inside. At the top of the first, an official DOJ letterhead and a stamp, confidential, internal, review only. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scanned the content. It was a breakdown of undeclared luxury gifts, private charter flights, off-the-record meetings, all directly tied to Justice Brett Kavanaugh. There were itemized logs from international resorts, hospitality receipts under false billing names, and handwritten annotations tracing them back to a network of political lobbyists operating through tax-exempt entities. Jasmine read in silence, each sentence peeling back another layer of the man who had just sentenced her with such disdain. She turned the page and froze. A wire transfer record stared back at her. $2.7 million, dated September 2016, routed through a Delaware-based nonprofit. Destination: a law firm specializing in confidential settlements. The memo line read only, "Special Circumstance Resolution." The corresponding internal memo noted the purpose plainly: a sexual misconduct claim settled out of court, sealed by NDA, with direct knowledge of the nominee's legal team during the vetting process. The woman's name was redacted, but the timeline was unmistakable. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't hearsay. This was a concealed truth, buried in silence and privilege, packaged for convenience and scrubbed from every public confirmation transcript. Further down the file were emails, dates, names, and locations, linking Kavanaugh to political donors and lobbyists, including a private retreat just 2 weeks before he ruled favorably on a billion-dollar lawsuit involving one of their firms. A wire transfer breakdown. $2.7 million routed through a nonprofit based in Delaware, used to settle a sexual misconduct claim from 2016, a claim that never reached public record. Another sheet listed undisclosed meetings with political operatives at a Colorado lodge just weeks before Kavanaugh ruled in favor of a corporation tied to their PAC. The documentation was airtight. There was no ambiguity, no guesswork. This wasn't speculation, it was evidence. Jasmine leaned back slowly, the leather envelope still open in her lap like a box of dynamite waiting for a spark. Her heart pounded, not with fear but clarity. What had started as a political ambush against her had just become something far more dangerous. an open path into the corrupted core of a system draped in robes and ritual, yet rotten beneath. For the first time that day, she smiled, barely, bitterly, because now she understood. This wasn't about clearing her name anymore. This was about exposing the truth behind the robe. By the time Jasmine re-entered the courtroom, she was no longer the defendant. They just didn't know it yet. The walls felt closer this time, as though the very architecture had turned against her. Cold, unspeaking, and complicit. From the gallery, eyes bore into her back like blades, not from curiosity but from expectation. Everyone was waiting to see how a woman publicly humiliated would carry herself in front of the man who tried to bury her. Kavanaugh remained perched on the bench like stone, his expression unreadable, but his fingers fidgeted against the armrest, a subtle betrayal of discomfort. Jasmine's heels clicked across the polished floor, echoing like a countdown. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She rose from her chair with the stillness of someone who'd already walked through the fire. The room didn't know that the woman standing now was no longer pleading for fairness. She was holding evidence of its absence. She spoke calmly, deliberately. "Your Honor," she said, voice strong but composed, "I request a final statement, for the record, to defend my name and my integrity." The silence that followed wasn't passive. It was taut, electric. Some reporters lifted their pens. Others stopped typing. The moment sat in the air like a loaded chamber. Kavanaugh didn't immediately respond. He looked down at the stack of documents on his desk as if searching for cover in legalese and parchment. For a second, it seemed he might deny her outright. "This hearing is concluded," he muttered flatly, the words more reflex than ruling. But outside, the walls of power were already trembling. The live stream counter had surged past 4.3 million. Editorial headlines screamed across major platforms. Justice or vendetta? Crockett silenced? Ethics in question. The pressure wasn't procedural anymore. It was political, national, historical. Kavanaugh knew it too. His delay wasn't legal hesitation. It was the realization that the narrative had slipped from his hands. His power, once unquestioned, now sat brittle beneath the weight of eyes he couldn't see but couldn't ignore. He lifted his head slowly, his mouth drawn into a tight line of forced authority. "Make it brief." His tone was clipped, but something in it had changed. Less certainty, more defense. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't smile. She gave the smallest nod, the kind you offer before taking a final step off the ledge, knowing you're not the one falling. Jasmine stepped forward, not as a defendant making a plea, but as a witness ready to put the system itself on trial. The weight of the room shifted, not because anyone moved, but because something unspoken had entered. Truth with teeth. Jasmine's heels echoed across the polished floor, not hurried, not uncertain, but exact. She paused at the podium, her fingers brushing the edges of her briefcase like a pianist before the first chord. Every camera in the courtroom had turned toward her, every eye fixed on the woman who had been silenced 2 days ago, and now stood like a blade they hadn't counted on. She didn't glance at her notes. She didn't clear her throat. Instead, with unflinching calm, she reached into the briefcase and withdrew the brown leather envelope. The same one slipped into her hand like contraband in a war zone. Her breath was steady, her grip sure. She opened it and unfolded the first document slowly, letting the seal of the Department of Justice face outward so that every journalist in the gallery could see the letters that had once been buried in the confidential ink. "This," she began, her voice clear but cool, "is a Department of Justice internal memo detailing a series of undeclared gifts received by Justice Brett Kavanaugh." No one interrupted. No one even shifted. Her tone was surgical, void of emotion, as if the facts were too damning to need drama. Private charter flights, luxury resort stays, financial donations from individuals with active cases before the court. The words dropped like lead. Each phrase carved deeper into the illusion of authority seated above her. She held the document aloft, then laid it flat on the podium, turning the page with the grace of someone who no longer feared what might happen, only what might remain hidden. Her eyes scanned the next sheet. This wasn't one gift or one meeting. This was a pattern, a network, a relationship between judgment and influence that should never coexist in the same breath. She read out the amounts: $14,000 for a private hunting trip, $9,800 in hotel accommodations, a $42,000 consulting fee to a shell entity tied to a known lobbying group. Behind her, the tension in the room tightened like a noose. Staffers held their breath. Reporters scribbled with frantic urgency. On screen, the live stream viewer count surged past 5 million. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She turned the third page, then the fourth. Her voice remained level, but her eyes, focused, locked on Kavanaugh, began to burn with a quiet fury. Undisclosed meetings at a Colorado lodge, a $2.7 million settlement funneled through a nonprofit to bury a misconduct allegation from 2016 during his nomination year. She paused. No one made a sound, not even Kavanaugh. She stared directly at him now, her words no longer aimed at the record, but at the man behind the robe. If I'm being suspended for words spoken into a microphone, then tell me, Your Honor, do you believe accepting yachts and cash from litigants sitting before you is somehow more ethical? The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was an indictment. The courtroom had shifted again, but this time it was seismic. Not a word had come from the bench. Not a breath from the press box. For the first time in his career, Brett Kavanaugh didn't have a rebuttal. He had a reckoning. But Jasmine wasn't finished, because truth doesn't whisper when it finally finds a microphone. She stepped aside just slightly, her presence still centered, but her focus now turned to the screen behind her. The clerk hesitated, but at Jasmine's subtle nod, the monitor clicked on with a soft hum, and suddenly the courtroom wasn't looking at a lawyer or a congresswoman anymore. They were staring into a secret they were never meant to see. The image was crisp, dated, and damning. Justice Brett Kavanaugh reclined on a leather chair at a luxury Colorado resort, flanked by men in designer hunting gear and holding a glass of scotch. But the man seated next to him drew every eye. Martin Chase, CEO of Agrinova Industries, the same company that had just months earlier faced a federal lawsuit for contaminating groundwater in 3 rural towns. The case had reached the Supreme Court. It had been denied without comment. Kavanaugh had voted not to hear it. Jasmine let the silence sit. Then she turned slowly back to the room and spoke, not with fire, but with surgical precision. This man, she said, her finger pointing to Chase, has a direct financial stake in a ruling justice Kavanaugh helped bury. This is not perception. This is pattern. Without waiting for rebuttal, Jasmine tapped a second file on the screen. This time the silence broke not with her voice, but someone else's, a young woman's, brittle and half-whispered, but soaked with the weight of something too dangerous to keep holding. He told me, the voice said trembling, that if I took it public, they'd destroy me. He said I'd lose my job, my reputation, that I didn't understand the forces I was playing with. The audio was low quality, but its message was crystal. He said it wouldn't be the judge who ruined me. It'd be the people around him, the ones who protect him. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't explain. She let the voice speak, her own silence making space for someone who had once been denied it. Then she said, measured and unwavering, that voice belongs to a former legal intern assigned to the Federal Vetting Committee in 2016. She filed a preliminary complaint that was never reviewed. Within weeks, she was removed from her position and blacklisted from 2 major DC law firms. The courtroom held still, not out of respect, but paralysis. When the recording ended, the final line echoed like a wound being reopened. I didn't stop because I was wrong. I stopped because I was warned. When the final words of the recording faded, they left behind something heavier than silence. They left consequence. No one moved. No one dared. The words of the young woman still echoed, not in sound, but in weight. I didn't stop because I was wrong. I stopped because I was warned. They clung to the courtroom walls like smoke after a detonation. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was exposure. The kind that doesn't go away with rebuttals or denials. The kind that settles into the bloodstream of a nation. And then without a word or signal, the senior Department of Justice official, who had been seated quietly at the far left bench, rose to his feet. He didn't adjust his tie. He didn't clear his throat. He simply closed his folder, tucked it under one arm, and walked out with quiet finality. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt historic, like someone stepping away from a table moments before it collapsed. He never looked toward the bench, but he didn't need to. His exit said everything. This no longer belongs to the courtroom. This now belongs to the law. Inside, the courtroom held its breath. The news cameras refocused. Jasmine remained still, but the lens had already shifted from her to him. Justice Brett Kavanaugh sat in total stillness, as if motion itself had become dangerous. His fingers clutched the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. Like the blood beneath them knew the gravity of what had just occurred. His eyes were locked forward, but unfocused, as if he could no longer see the room, only the reckoning rising around him. The robe that once gave him dominion now looked heavy, almost ill-fitting, like a costume worn too long. The illusion of invulnerability, of a man untouched by consequence, had been cracked in front of a live audience of millions. And the silence that followed wasn't respect, it was realization. Everyone in that chamber, from junior clerks to senior press correspondents, could feel it pressing down like a shifting ceiling. The bench was no longer a shield, the robe was no longer a wall, and the man behind both was now exposed. No gavel came down, no voice called order, no motion to recess was offered, because for the first time in his career, Brett Kavanaugh couldn't control what came next. His authority, once absolute in rooms like this, had become radioactive, something even his colleagues might soon refuse to touch. He didn't speak. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say, nothing that wouldn't be a whisper against the roar of what had just been made visible. And though Jasmine hadn't moved since the DOJ official left, her presence had grown, not in volume, but in truth. She wasn't rising. The room was sinking into something it had long avoided, accountability, and still no one spoke. But the silence had changed. It was no longer fear. It was the kind of stillness that follows a verdict. From somewhere outside the room, a buzz stirred, first in the gallery, then in the row of reporters, and finally in the sharp rustle of a clerk's earpiece snapping to life. Jasmine didn't move. Kavanaugh didn't blink. But the wave was coming. The Department of Justice, watching everything in real time, had seen enough. Within minutes, it became official. A senior DOJ spokesperson, standing before a bank of microphones just steps from the courthouse, declared the suspension of Justice Brett Kavanaugh's special supervisory role in all pending judicial proceedings, effective immediately. The announcement was delivered calmly, without flourish, but inside the courtroom, it felt like a thunderclap. The words arrived like a line of dominoes slamming through the room, toppling every illusion of immunity that had once held firm around the man in black robes. The gallery erupted, not in noise, but in tension-breaking. Some gasped. Others closed their eyes as if they had been holding their breath for too many years. Jasmine remained motionless, a study in restrained vindication. She didn't raise a fist. She didn't nod. But her stillness was louder than applause. Then came the second wave. A court officer stepped to the front of the chamber, paper in hand, and read a prepared statement. By order of judicial review, the 5-year suspension previously imposed upon Representative Jasmine Crockett is hereby vacated, retroactively nullified. This ruling was found to be in violation of standard procedural safeguards and constitutional fairness. Another pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, but with the weight of institutional confession, the clerk added, "The court apologizes for the irregular process by which the original sanction was administered." It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt that Jasmine would ever receive, and yet she remained silent. All eyes turned back to the bench, but Kavanaugh didn't rise. Not yet. For the first time since his appointment to the highest court in the land, he looked smaller than the robe that had always made him larger. His hand sat flat on the desk, not gripping, not defiant, just suspended. The robe hung differently now, no longer a symbol of dominion, but a curtain drawn too far, revealing the man beneath. He scanned the room but saw no allies. The staff avoided his gaze. The stenographer kept typing, eyes fixed on her keyboard. Even the security officer near the exit, once alert and attentive, now leaned slightly back, neutral, detached. The spell had broken. The fear had shifted. Power no longer radiated from the bench. It now hummed from the center of the room, where Jasmine stood without raising her voice. Finally, with the stiffness of someone walking into the wind, Kavanaugh pushed back his chair. The sound of the wheels scraping against the marble floor seemed too loud for such a sacred space. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at the gallery. He just stood there, pausing long enough to let the weight of the moment hang in the air like smoke. His eyes, once sharp and sure, were lowered now, not in humility, but in resignation. There was no press conference, no justification, no words about due process or misunderstanding. Just a man in silence, walking out of a room he once ruled, under the cold stares of a country that had watched him unravel in real time. As he reached the door, a bailiff moved to open it for him, but hesitated. Kavanaugh reached out instead, gripped the handle, and pulled it himself. The door swung slowly inward, its hinges giving off a quiet, deliberate groan. The moment was intimate and devastating. And then he stepped through, not as a justice, not even as a judge, but simply as a man retreating from the gravity of truth. The door closed behind him with a final, echoing click. It didn't slam, it didn't creak, but it sealed something. The illusion, the era, the lie. The courtroom didn't cheer. There were no standing ovations. No one dared make the moment smaller than it was. Because what had just happened wasn't a spectacle. It was a shift, a quiet revolution written not in blood, but in documents. Not shouted, but proven. And Jasmine, she remained where she was, still, whole, unmoved in her body, but transformed in what she now carried. Not just vindication, but momentum. For the first time in a very long time, justice had taken a step forward without flinching, and it had started with a woman they tried to silence. The door closed behind him, but Jasmine didn't move. Because this moment wasn't about his exit. It was about what came next. No one said a word. The chamber, once ruled by sharp gavels and sharpened egos, now belonged to something else entirely. The kind of silence that doesn't just follow collapse, it clears space for creation. Jasmine stood alone at the center of it, the storm having passed, but the wind of history still stirring around her. She didn't smile. She didn't blink back tears. There was no fist in the air, no press-ready pose. She stood the way a survivor does, tired, unshaken, and entirely present. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to bask in vindication. It was to make sure no one ever had to fight this battle again. "I don't need him to lose his position," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness like clean glass. "I need a system where he could never have used it as a shield for wrongdoing in the first place." The words landed like a second verdict, not against a man, but against the architecture that protected him. Reporters leaned forward in their chairs. A few members of Congress shifted in their seats, no longer scribbling notes but simply listening, as if afraid missing a sentence would mean missing the very beginning of something. Jasmine took a breath, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood the gravity of speaking aloud what had been buried for so long. This wasn't a reaction. It was a redirection. A woman, wronged, doubted, nearly destroyed, was now drawing new lines for the justice system itself. Slowly, without theatricality, she placed 3 sheets of paper on the podium in front of her. Each one had just a few lines, typed in bold, clear font. No footnotes, no legalese, only truth stripped of armor. The first, an independent judicial ethics commission, fully separate from the executive branch. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The room understood. Oversight that answers to no president, no political party, no judicial clique. A body that could hold the robed and the powerful to the same moral code expected of the powerless. For decades, justices had policed themselves, and look where that had brought them. Now Jasmine was calling for the wall of self-regulation to come down, brick by brick. The second, mandatory disclosure of all gifts, favors, and financial relationships exceeding $1,000, updated quarterly, audited publicly. Some shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine noticed, but didn't flinch. This was the clause that would choke off the back-channel power brokers, the donors who gifted vacations in exchange for legal invisibility, the shell companies that masked influence as hospitality. Justice, she said plainly, cannot be bought in cigars, scotch, and invitations to the lodge. It was a line for the cameras, but it was also a line for history. And then came the third, perhaps the most important. She held the page up for everyone to see before saying the words. Absolute whistleblower protection for judicial staff, clerks, researchers, and court-adjacent personnel. There were murmurs now, not from the public, but from within. Jasmine didn't look away. No woman, she said quietly, should be threatened into silence by the very office that claims to uphold the law. It wasn't performative. It was personal. The voice in the recording was no longer just evidence. It was policy waiting to be born. Jasmine let her final sentence hang in the air. Without protection for truth-tellers, the truth never gets told. No one interrupted. The room didn't break into applause. It wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, something deeper happened. Hands began to move. Not with defiance, but with intention. One by one, aides, staffers, and even sitting members of Congress began jotting notes. Some leaned toward their colleagues, whispering. Others took photos of the proposal sheets. No one raised objection. No one asked her to clarify. It was as if the chamber, after years of functioning like a machine of ritual and delay, had finally been shocked into focus. What Jasmine had just placed on the record wasn't a wish list. It was a roadmap out of rot, and the only question left was who would have the courage to follow it. She didn't wait for confirmation. She didn't demand support. She simply stood back from the podium, took a breath, and turned her gaze not toward the people on the dais, but toward the young interns sitting in the rear rows, the ones who had watched this hearing not as a story of power, but as a question of whether justice was still alive. Jasmine gave them a nod, subtle, silent, but unmistakably meant for them. In the hallway beyond the chamber, the media swarm had begun to mobilize again. Newsrooms were rewriting headlines in real time. Crockett reforms was trending within minutes. But inside the chamber, the moment remained untouched by noise, a historic silence. The kind of pause not filled with uncertainty, but with potential. One aide whispered, "It's already started." Another responded, "No, she just started it." And Jasmine? She walked out slowly, not victorious, not defiant, just steady, like someone who had finally put the burden down and picked up something better. Momentum tethered to principle. She didn't need the last word. She already had the first truth. The world outside the courtroom didn't wait for permission. It erupted. What started as a clipped live stream and a few stunned reporters walking out with shaking hands had within hours turned into something much larger, something far less controllable. Within 24 hours, the video of Jasmine confronting Justice Kavanaugh had been viewed over 70 million times. The full clip, unedited, uninterrupted, spread like electricity on every platform. It wasn't a speech. It was a rupture. The moment she read the DOJ memo, the look on Kavanaugh's face, the recording of the intern's trembling voice, and then the final line, "Do you believe accepting yachts and cash from litigants is somehow more ethical?" punched its way into the collective bloodstream of the country. Commentators didn't dissect it. They surrendered to it. No one could look away. That night, hashtags stormed to the top of every trending list across the nation. Kavanaugh files. Justice no privilege. Jasmine speaks truth. They weren't just slogans, they were pressure points. Thousands of law students posted clips of Jasmine's speech with captions like, "This is why I applied to law school." Veterans reposted the video and wrote, "I fought for this country so someone like her could finally say this aloud." Civil rights leaders called it the most significant courtroom moment since Anita Hill. Even in corners of the internet long divided by ideology, something had cracked. Not the rage, but the silence. It was no longer about left or right. It was about who the law serves and who it protects. Within Congress, the effect was instantaneous. At 10:42 a.m. the next morning, the Speaker of the House formally announced the creation of a special oversight committee, its mandate to investigate the judicial appointment and vetting process of every Supreme Court justice confirmed in the last 20 years. The resolution passed with bipartisan support within hours. Reporters on the Hill said they'd never seen legislative pens move that fast. Behind closed doors, aides whispered about what would come next. Closed-door hearings, subpoena power, classified clearance to unseal old ethics complaints buried during confirmation votes. And in private rooms across Washington, senior staffers began asking the question no one dared say aloud in public yet. If this is what's on the surface, what's underneath? Outside government, the ground moved too. Law professors rewrote entire lecture syllabi overnight. Universities began streaming Jasmine's testimony in ethics classes, constitutional law classes, even communication studies. One Harvard professor told CNN, "This is what institutional courage looks like. This is what precedent should respond to." Meanwhile, whistleblower advocacy groups received a spike in encrypted emails and burner calls from court clerks, administrative staff, and junior attorneys, many of whom had never spoken out before, but now had a name, a face, and a line in the sand. Jasmine had spoken the truth and survived. Now it was their turn. What had once been a closed culture was unraveling thread by thread. Not everyone was ready. Inside the judicial branch, a panic spread in quieter ways. Long-standing judges, once shielded by seniority and silence, suddenly found themselves the subject of internal reviews. Financial disclosure websites saw surges in FOIA requests from watchdog organizations and local news outlets. One judicial ethics officer admitted anonymously to Politico, "We were told to expect protest. We weren't told to expect exposure." What made this different, what made it dangerous, wasn't just the proof. It was the tone. Jasmine hadn't shouted, she hadn't dramatized. She had simply revealed, and in doing so, forced the institutions to reveal themselves. Cable networks cleared their primetime schedules. MSNBC aired a 90-minute special called "The Truth Behind the Robe." Fox News was forced to cover the story after internal polling showed 62% of its own viewers had watched the clip. Even late-night hosts dropped the jokes. One opened with a single sentence, "Last night, America saw what it looks like when someone speaks truth in a place where lies used to sit." And yet through it all, Jasmine said nothing. No press tour, no victory lap, no self-congratulation. She refused offers from every major network, every morning show, every high-profile roundtable. Her team issued only one statement: Jasmine Crockett's work speaks for itself. And now, so must the system. Back in Texas, she returned to her district office as quietly as she had left it. The same streets that once saw her chased, doubted, shouted down, now lined with people holding handwritten signs that read, "Let her speak," and "No more silent benches." In one photo, a father knelt beside his young daughter, pointing to Jasmine as she passed and saying, "That's what courage looks like." She nodded in return. No speeches, just movement, just forward. But the earthquake was far from over. Inside the walls of the Capitol, something tectonic had shifted. Justice was no longer a word reserved for verdicts and ceremonies. It had become something active, sharp, demandable. And it had started, not in a war room, not on a campaign stage, but inside a federal courtroom where one woman alone, armed with truth, had faced power and refused to bow. From that confrontation came not chaos, but clarity. A nation had watched the system flinch. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, it had reason to believe it could still rise. Because the ground may have shaken, but the woman at the center of it all, she never did. And just like that, the cameras turned. But Jasmine did not. While news anchors raced to out-edit each other, and pundits argued over whether the hearing had marked the beginning or the end of something seismic, Jasmine disappeared. Not into hiding, but into reflection. For days, the media speculated, was she resting, negotiating a leadership bid, preparing to take a national stage? The truth was simpler and more dangerous to those in power. Jasmine didn't want a headline. She wanted a reckoning to outlive the spotlight. She declined every major network request. She turned down 2 Sunday specials, 3 front-page interviews, and a personal invitation from 60 Minutes. It wasn't disinterest, it was discipline. Jasmine knew the story wasn't her. It was what she had uncovered. And so, when she finally spoke again, it wasn't with a microphone. It was with a pen. Her essay appeared online at 6 a.m. sharp, published not through a campaign surrogate or media consultant, but directly through The Atlantic. The headline was stark. No punctuation, no apology, just one line. Justice does not come from a black robe. It comes from light aimed at the places power fears most, the truth. The piece was less than 800 words, but it hit harder than any closing argument she'd ever delivered in court. She didn't repeat the hearing. She didn't name names. Instead, she stripped the theater from justice and asked America to look behind the curtain. She wrote about the silence of courtrooms, about the weight of tradition mistaken for fairness, and about how unchecked reverence can become a hiding place for rot. She challenged the reader to remember that judges are not gods, and robes are not armor. A democracy doesn't crumble when it questions power, she wrote. It crumbles when it forgets how. By noon, the piece had been reprinted in over 100 publications and translated into 7 languages. One law professor called it the Gettysburg Address of Judicial Reform. But Jasmine didn't engage. She wasn't building momentum. She was building legislation. Exactly 1 week after her courtroom confrontation, Jasmine Crockett returned to Capitol Hill. Not with cameras, but with copies. She stood before the House clerk's office at precisely 10 a.m., surrounded only by a small team of aides, and submitted the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act of 2025. No speech, no rally, just an unshakable set of documents, and a title that made its mission clear. Inside its pages, mandatory financial disclosures for all federal judges, quarterly ethics audits by an independent commission, a lifetime ban on judges ruling in cases involving known benefactors, and full whistleblower protections for any court personnel reporting misconduct. It was bold, it was detailed, and it was non-negotiable. This was not a framework. This was a line in the sand. What happened next wasn't planned. As the clerk stamped the documents and entered them into the legislative record, something unprecedented began to unfold. Congressional offices, Democratic and Republican alike, began placing calls, not to attack the bill, not to delay it, to co-sponsor it. One by one, names appeared beside Jasmine's on the official registry. Lawmakers who had never agreed on tax policy, abortion, climate, or trade stood side by side under one column for the first time in recent memory. By sundown, the bill had over 40 co-sponsors, 20 from each side of the aisle. By midnight, it had 92. Political analysts were stunned. One former Senate Majority Leader told PBS, "I haven't seen this kind of legislative alignment since the post-Watergate reforms, and even those took months." But this was different. This wasn't born from pressure. It was born from clarity. Jasmine hadn't demanded allegiance. She had made silence impossible. Inside Capitol Hill, the atmosphere shifted. Meetings grew longer. Hallway conversations stopped being performative. Staffers stopped pretending they hadn't seen the hearing. Everyone had. But now no one could pretend it didn't matter. The Judiciary Committee scheduled an emergency briefing within 48 hours. Ethics watchdogs were brought in for consultation. Budget analysts began estimating the cost of the new commission, not to stall, but to accelerate. Jasmine attended none of it. She didn't need to. She'd already drawn the blueprint. Now others were racing to keep up. Outside, the public responded with something deeper than applause. They showed up. In front of courthouses across the country, citizens left folded notes on courthouse steps, each one bearing handwritten quotes from Jasmine's Atlantic piece. In Los Angeles, justice isn't a performance. It's an audit. In Atlanta, respect is earned, immunity is not. In Chicago, someone projected her final courtroom question onto the side of the federal building. Do you believe accepting yachts and cash is somehow more ethical? For the first time in decades, judicial reform was not only on the national agenda, it was personal. People didn't just want better judges. They wanted transparency. They wanted accountability. And they wanted it not as a political wedge, but as a patriotic obligation. Jasmine hadn't given them a scandal. She had given them a standard. And in doing so, she had reshaped the terms of debate, not just for one court or one bill, but for an entire generation of lawmaking. The irony, of course, was that Jasmine never said she wanted change. She showed what happened when you removed the shield that prevented it. She didn't burn the institution. She turned on the lights. And as the chamber filled with the glow of clarity, the darkness that had long hidden inside it had nowhere left to go. That week, the New York Times ran a cover story with a photo of Jasmine standing outside the clerk's office, head bowed, papers in hand. The headline read simply, "She didn't shout. She documented." And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like the country wasn't just watching government, it was watching accountability become law. She had changed the law. But to Jasmine, real victory would always be quieter, measured not in votes, but in voices. After 2 weeks of headlines, hearings, and hashtags, Jasmine did something no staffer expected. She booked a one-way flight to Dallas, turned off her phone, and drove through the long stretch of Texas highway that she knew like muscle memory. No cameras, no press, no applause. Just the sky overhead, wide and stormless, and the feeling that she was no longer returning to where she started, but to the place that had first shown her why fighting mattered. The high school still stood like a block of memory on cracked pavement. It hadn't changed much. The gym looked smaller than she remembered. The security office still had the same broken sign, but the auditorium lights were on, and inside 300 students sat in metal chairs, waiting for a girl they'd only seen on screens. The one who had just faced down the highest court in the land and made it blink. She didn't walk in like a hero. She walked in like someone still tired from carrying the truth. The principal greeted her with a nod, and a kind of hush followed her to the podium. Not silence out of formality, but reverence born from recognition. The kind that says, "We know what you've been through, even if we can't name it." Jasmine stood in front of them, back straight, hands relaxed, eyes scanning the crowd, not for approval, but connection. The last time she was in this room, she was 17, sitting in the second to last row, suspended for disrupting a lesson on the Constitution by asking why her neighborhood had fewer polling stations. Now she was the woman who had written a law to answer that question. She didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. She told them about what the courtroom really felt like. Not the wood and the lights, but the weight. The kind that presses down when you know you're not just speaking for yourself. She told them what it was like to be underestimated and then punished for proving them wrong. And then toward the back of the room, a hand rose. A junior in a plain red hoodie. His voice was steady but young. "Weren't you scared?" he asked. "When that Supreme Court justice was right in front of you, weren't you afraid?" There was a beat of silence. Then Jasmine smiled. Not the smile of pride, but of someone remembering something sacred. "I wasn't standing in front of him," she said softly. "I was standing behind everyone who'd ever been silenced and never had a microphone to answer back." The room didn't erupt. It inhaled. A teacher at the side of the stage wiped their eyes. Another student whispered, "Damn," and under their breath, not as a joke, but as a reverence. That sentence didn't just sit in the air. It carved itself into the walls. It wasn't just something she said. It was something she lived. The injustice, the silence, the survival, and now the return. Jasmine didn't explain it further. She didn't have to. They understood, because that line didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to everyone who heard it and finally saw themselves in the shape of someone who had refused to disappear. Word of the visit spread, but Jasmine still refused interviews. Instead, 2 days later, someone posted a photo online. It was taken from inside the main reading room of Columbia Law School, the very school that once rejected Jasmine's application due to insufficient academic fit. In the photo, etched in bronze across the entrance wall, were her words, "I wasn't standing in front of him. I was standing behind everyone who'd ever been silenced and never had a microphone to answer back." No caption, just the quote. And beneath it, in smaller font, Jasmine Crockett, Congressional Hearing Transcript, 2025. The post went viral within hours, not because it was flashy, but because it was final. A full circle moment written not in triumph, but in truth. The kind of legacy that can't be awarded, only earned. Law students began posting photos beside it. Professors rearranged syllabi to include her case study. Civil rights groups submitted proposals to adopt the quote as part of ethics training. And back in Texas, Jasmine received a letter, handwritten, no return address. It said, "You stood for me before I even knew what to ask for. Now I know. I'll take it from here." She didn't reply. She didn't need to, because the mission was never to finish the fight. It was to make sure no one ever stood alone in it again. She had walked off the stage, but the moment kept walking with her. It trailed behind her not like glory but like gravity, tethering every step she took to the weight of those who came before her and the eyes of those who would come next. In every hallway she entered, every courthouse she passed, Jasmine could feel the shift, not in architecture, but in expectation. People didn't look at her like a headline. They looked at her like a mirror. And in that mirror was a question no one had dared ask out loud in a courtroom like the one she had stood in. What if truth isn't the threat, but the cure? Her story had become more than an act of resistance. It had become a challenge to a nation's conscience. The gavel had fallen, the cameras had shut off, but the reckoning was just beginning. Because truth doesn't leave when the lights do. It lingers, it echoes, it becomes a standard. And what Jasmine did wasn't just about one man in one robe on one bench. It was about an entire system that had learned to confuse ritual with righteousness. For decades, Americans had been taught that judges wore robes because they were neutral, not because they were hidden. That verdicts were law, not leverage. That precedent was sacred, no matter what injustice it protected. But Jasmine didn't come to court to ask questions. She came to answer them. She came with receipts, not rage, with truth, not spectacle. She didn't need to scream. She needed only to speak with the kind of clarity that left no place for excuses to hide. And in doing so, she showed the world that silence is not professionalism. It's complicity dressed as decorum. And what she stood against was far more insidious than corruption. It was comfort. The kind of comfort that lets power police itself, that lets judges rule on ethics while excusing their own, that lets procedural words like inadmissible erase real lives. Jasmine stood in a room where the expectation was silence, and she brought daylight. She peeled back the layers of decorum to show that even the most sophisticated machinery of law can be a cage if no one questions its gears. And in that room, she did what few had done before. She broke the illusion, not with spectacle, but with sequence, fact by fact, file by file. And when the robe trembled, it wasn't because she shouted, it was because she didn't have to. The lesson wasn't that power falls easily, it's that power shifts when someone holds the line long enough. Jasmine held it, through suspension, through character assassination, through veiled threats in hallways and closed-door whispers that warned her this would follow her forever. And still she stood. Not because she was invincible, but because she refused to be invisible. Every time she walked back into that courtroom, she brought with her every girl told her voice was too sharp. Every intern warned to be grateful, not difficult. Every public defender who had to choose between justice and their next paycheck. She walked in as one, but she stood for many. And when the moment came, she didn't use it to punish, she used it to propose. That was the real lesson. Accountability isn't vengeance, it's repair. And repair begins when truth becomes policy. Because Jasmine didn't just speak, she legislated. The Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act wasn't just a response, it was a roadmap. A declaration that power, if it is to be trusted, must be measured, monitored, and made answerable. Her proposals were simple but seismic. Public audits, ethical independence, and protection for those who dared tell the truth. It wasn't radical, it was overdue. And the fact that it was treated like revolution proved just how long justice had been starved of reform. Jasmine didn't just ask the country to believe her, she gave them the tools to believe in the law again. And the law, for the first time in a long time, began to feel like it belonged to the people, not the powerful. The courthouse that once silenced whistleblowers now displayed her words on the lobby wall. Law schools that once rejected her now taught her argument in first-year classes. Her quote had become scripture in the places that once called her too much. And that, perhaps, was the most human truth of all. That change doesn't come from being allowed in. It comes from walking in anyway, from breaking the frame, from standing where you were told you didn't belong and refusing to leave quietly. Jasmine had done that. And because she had, a door was now open, not just for women or people of color or the silenced, but for truth itself. And yet, in all of this, she never called herself brave. She didn't wear the moment like armor. She didn't turn it into a brand. She turned it into a baton, something to be handed off to students, to voters, to clerks too afraid to name what they'd seen until now. Because the story Jasmine lived is not a singular triumph. It is a blueprint for moral defiance in a world that rewards complicity. It is a reminder that the most radical thing you can do in a broken institution is refuse to break. And when you do, something rare happens. The institution begins to bend instead. That's the lesson. That justice is not born in robes, rituals, or rankings. It is born in people who risk themselves to protect what the system forgot. It is born when courage looks like clarity, when survival becomes structure, when one voice becomes enough to start a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett reminded us of that, and not through force, but through focus, through refusal, through the steady, relentless act of making power answer to truth instead of fear. Because in the end, the most human lesson of all is this: justice will never belong to the powerful until it first belongs to the powerless. And it begins the moment someone decides to speak, not louder, but truer. But a story like Jasmine's doesn't end with applause. It ends with a question. What will you do with what you now know? It's easy to watch someone else carry the fire and mistake that for your own heat. Easy to retweet, repost, and reflect. Then return to silence. But silence is what power depends on. Silence is what keeps the same doors closed, the same voices shut out, the same names in headlines while the same hands stay unaccountable. Jasmine didn't fight for praise. She fought to remind you that democracy was never meant to be a spectator sport. That law was never meant to be worshipped. It was meant to be wielded, and wielded by us, the students, the workers, the voters, the ones without robes, gavels, or platforms. If you feel a fire in your chest after watching her stand, that's not admiration. That's instruction. So what now? You demand the hearings. You call the representatives. You show up at the town halls and you don't leave until they answer. You read the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act, and then you ask, who in your state hasn't co-sponsored it yet, and why? You take Jasmine's words, you post them on walls, in classrooms, on courthouse steps, not because it's trendy, but because it's necessary. You protect whistleblowers. You believe survivors. You fund public defenders. You don't wait for someone to ask for your voice. You offer it, knowing it could be the one that breaks open the silence someone else is trapped inside. Because injustice isn't some distant villain. It's a machine powered by quiet. And right now your voice is voltage. You don't have to stand in a courtroom to stand for justice, but you do have to stand somewhere. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.